Well, welcome everyone to another church history lecture. Thank you so much for being here. Say a quick prayer and then we'll start the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for the time that you are giving us to come together. We thank you for your presence in this place. Lord, I ask you to be with those who can't be here tonight, especially those who are ill. Lord, I ask that if your will allows, that you would touch them and heal them, that you would bring their bodies back to good health, and that they would be able to join us again very soon. Lord, I thank you so much for those who are here. I pray that we are continuing to learn, and ultimately I pray that everything we're learning and all of the time we're spending and the effort we're putting in, that it would just bring us closer to you, that we would glorify you, that we would lift your name, and we would further your kingdom through the study of your history. So we just thank you again so much for being a part of this and a part of our lives. And we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so I want to wrap up. I didn't get to this last week. After talking about Germany. So we talked about Nazism and Hitler. He was a totalitarianist. Nazism is a form of national socialism. We talked a little bit about this last week. I'm just going to run through this. The government under a Nazi regime, it does promote the perfect race. And what they were trying to do, especially after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and Germany felt very picked on, basically, and kind of the other countries were sort of coming against them and really coming down. And they really never forgot the way that they were treated throughout that whole process. And so, remember, Germany, their government was basically gone, and they tried to bring up a democratic government. It didn't work out. A lot of the reason, or one of the primary reasons that it didn't work out, was because our country hit the Great Depression, and the loans that we were able to supply at one time were no longer available. And then the loans that we had already supplied, we were asking for that money to come due. So we just weren't able to support the way that we once were. And so that democratic attempt sort of crumbled. And then, as it turns out, this man Adolf Hitler, was put into a fairly powerful position. And within just a few months, he had taken basically control of the government and begun to run things in his unique way. What he was trying to do, and what Germany was really looking forward to, what they were wanting him to do, was get back to this idea of old Germany. Let's take our old Germany back. We want to be able to reconnect and reestablish what we once were before the First World War. And so, in order to do that, they were sort of, it's an interesting blend. Basically, anything that was foreign was off limits. So they didn't want any foreign influences. And you can understand on some level, at least one reason why they wouldn't is because their foreign influences were very harsh and mean to them for several years. I mean, they were also in World War I. Let's not forget Germany's part to play in all of this. I mean, but they were just treated in a way, as we look back on history, that perhaps could have been handled differently. So they were trying to get back to their former purified self, so to speak, and they basically tried to build this master race, or take this perfect race that was already in Germany and manifest that, and at the same time diminish other races. And it wasn't just racist against the Jewish people, but they turned out to be the primary victim and the primary target. And many, or some, have the theory that it dates back to Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, the way that he spoke and wrote before he passed away, and the seedbed, so to speak, of anti-Semitism that was planted throughout Germany. And then whenever all of this happened, Hitler comes into power, they're trying to regain, and it just kind of exploded. That's not the full reason that all of these things happen. It's just one perspective, or one contributor. So that's Hitler and Nazism. Now, while all of this was going on, Around the same time, I put these dates up here so that you could try to kind of have a timeline. So last week we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, and it was signed in 1918. Just a couple of years, or actually a year before that, in Russia in 1917, the Tsar Nicholas II, he was abdicated. So he was basically forced to resign. He and his family had to go into hiding because he knew that they were in danger. So in February of that year, he abdicates his power. And by November, 10 months later, something like that, 8 months later, the Bolsheviks came in and they took over the government. And it's known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And then, just a few short months after that, World War II ended and the Treaty of Versailles was signed. So all of this is sort of overlapping itself a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about what was happening in Russia. Whenever the Bolsheviks came in, they were an atheistic governing group. They were hostile toward any sort of organized religion. So the only tolerant religion, if you want to call it a religion, is atheism. They were a dictatorship. They had a single party that was in control of everything. They were a terror to the people that came up against them. They were very ruthless. They had total censorship over the country, so they controlled what came in, they controlled what went out, they controlled the media, the radio, everything, the economy, everything was being controlled. So they came in, and Russia was not devastated at this point, but was in a bad position. And so it was prime for sort of the picking for the Bolsheviks to come in and completely take over. The person who took over was this man named Vladimir Ulyanov. That may be how you pronounce it, maybe not. He is also known as Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. It's interesting that Lenin is not his actual last name. It turns out that he had a couple of pseudonames. Apparently Lenin was one of those, and it was the one that stuck. So his actual name was not Lenin, but here you go. So he was in control or in power for about 7 years. He was a die-hard Marxist, very, very loyal to the idea of Marxist ideology, meaning that capitalism would eventually be taken over. The lower class would come in and take over, and socialism would take control, and then eventually the middle class would come in and they would take control, and it would become a communist unit. Now, whenever Lenin took control, his purpose, his idea when he took control of Russia was not to terrorize and create the name for himself that he created. When he went in, he was truly trying to take this revolution, this government system that was failing. He was a part of the group that was taking over this government and given this position, and he really wanted Russia to thrive. Because he was a loyal Marxist, he did not believe in capitalism at all, and he really believed that if you could get to a place where communism was the government, where everything was under one control, there was a completely classless society that everyone would be taken care of, and the government would be taken care of, and everything would run smooth. So his true heart was to save the country, not to come in and you hear so much about what he did or what the atrocities that he did, but that was not his initial. That was not what he intended to do when he took over the government. He's credited with starting the USSR, with giving that name. So his goal was to destroy capitalism and establish communism. He was quite brutal. I found something that I wanted to read to you about him. Now, this is a commentary that was written by somebody else. So basically third-party information, and it's just to give you an idea of somebody else's research that they did and the conclusion that they came to. So take it for what it's worth. Lenin had such an utter disregard for human life except where his own family and closest associates were concerned. It was Lenin who instigated the Red Terror, which saw widespread arrests and executions throughout the land. The aim of the terror was described by one of Lenin's foot soldiers as being to kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. For the blood of Lenin, let there be floods of blood of the Borgonese, more blood. Sorry, I got a phone call. More blood as much as possible. Lenin ordered the creation of the, I don't know how to say this, the Cheka, the Cheka. I'm sure that's not pronounced I'm sure that has a Russian pronunciation, and I don't know what that is. He ordered the creation of this group of people, the secret police. They were the secret police organization, which was a model for Hitler's Gestapo. They were known for unspeakable cruelties. Their methods included crowning victims with barbed wire, stoning them to death, dunking people in boiling water, and scalping them. Somebody who wrote about the Spanish Inquisition said, this tragedy sums their violence up as matched only by the Spanish Inquisition. So there was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of and he wasn't just randomly going through and doing this to people. He was doing this to the people that he felt were a threat to what he was trying to establish. Okay, so anyone who spoke out against him or tried to come up in power. He died in 1924, apparently from a stroke or a series of strokes. So he died. Many of the articles, which is not many, maybe 5 or 10, something like that. Many of the articles, when they talk about his death, they talk about how it was a young death, and he really died before his time was up. This man, Joseph Stalin, took his place. Interestingly, when he took power, he emphasized the working class, but was working toward a classless government, a society, yes. So Stalin was a staunch student of Lenin, and there again, therefore a staunch Marxist. He was exceptionally brutal, very, very harsh. Some of the stuff that I read, and again, this is, you'd have to do your own research, but a lot of what I read said that he was paranoid about someone usurping his power, or some group of people coming in, or, just something. He's just paranoid. And so he literally went through his ranks and killed people in his ranks because he thought, oh, you're after me, or, oh, you're forming a secret group, or, oh, you're doing this. And so he, killing generals and, people in his cabinet, so to speak. And then if you were somebody who actually came up against him from outside of his close group camp, people that, if he didn't know you at all, forget it. Like he had no problem taking care of whatever he felt was a opposition. He did use many, many terror tactics, one of which were labor camps, which sounds very familiar. He used labor camps to hold people prisoner, to torture them, to starve them. He did some things that were, as it turns out, counterproductive, but this is what happens whenever, when we talked about mob mentality, whenever, sometimes you go in with the right intention, but then sort of the energy of the place or the mood of the crowd changes everything and it gets crazy. His paranoia kind of did that to him. He was making decisions for his entire country that ended up turning around and biting the country sort of in the foot or whatever. So, for example, he would cut off supplies to certain countries because he was afraid people were going to invade, or he was afraid people were going to steal, or, whatever, just paranoid. And so he was cutting off supplies. Well, he ended up starving out thousands and thousands of his own people. I mean, like, he wasn't feeding his own people in his attempts to keep control of things. He was also, there was something else he did, and I had it and it just slipped my mind. Along those same lines. Now I can't remember what it was. If I think of it, I'll tell you. Anyway, his paranoia was driving him to make decisions for his country that ended up killing a lot of his people. Under Lenin, it was estimated that there were easily 28,000 executions a year. Okay, and I'm not saying it's conservative as in it has to be more, but it's definitely a conservative number. It's something that apparently most people who study this history would agree that that's a fair number. Stalin was much worse because he would blanketly go in and just take everybody out that he felt was a threat. The interesting statistic that I want to give to you, and if you Google this, you'll be surprised at the range that there is out there. But so Hitler is credited with killing 6 million Jews, and that's a conservative number. He's credited with being responsible for the death of 6 million Jews. He's also credited with the death of about 5 million non-Jews. So, and that's those numbers, as you look them up, I encourage you to do that. Google them. You'll see different numbers. There'll be a range, but I just picked a number. So 6 million Jewish people, and then about 5 million non-Jewish people while he was in power. Stalin is credited with anywhere from 60 to 100 million. Now, 100 million sounds a little bit out of control for me. However, what do I know? I haven't done the research. I'm just telling you, if you Google it, you're going to find maybe as low as 40, as high as 100, whatever. But in general, about 10 times more deaths through, especially if you put them together. You put Lenin and Stalin together, and you've got, and this is their own country. I mean, and it's not that the Jewish people were not the German people, but this was very pointed and directed. This was just trying to take control and maintain control and keep the opposition down. So it's a very, very bloody time. Then it's also been, I saw it in, I think, 2 of the articles that I read, people said that if Lenin had lived to his prime, so to speak, because people's like, oh, he just died young, he died early in his administration, whatever. If he had actually lived, the estimates are that he would have actually been worse than Stalin by the time he died. But, you can kind of see where they're coming from. His students were becoming, his student was worse than him, but he didn't live long enough to meet his potential in that area. So anyway, that was what was happening in Germany and Russia around the time of the end of World War I. All right.
What were they killing their people for?
Yeah, it was, Lenin was killing people to maintain his control. He was killing people to maintain control, but he was so paranoid that he was going way overboard. He was killing people that had no intention of, very likely, he was killing people, especially within his own government, that had no intention of going against him. So, it's sort of and I'm making this up, I didn't read this, but basically if he heard a whisper, that was it. That was it, because he was so paranoid that he believed, even what he didn't hear, he believed what he thought up. Do you know what I'm saying? So he was just kind of...
listening to the voices in his head.
Yeah, he was listening to himself, that's right. So I'm not saying he was crazy, like actually clinically crazy, but he did not have an issue, he had a bit of a bloodlust, although he didn't personally kill all these people, but he had no problem. That's one of the things that's another thing to think about as the leader. It's very easy to say, go kill those 300 people. You're not the one doing it. Not to say that he didn't kill people, because he did, but they both did. But they were giving orders, so it's a little bit less hands-on there, Kind of sounds like a mob or, things you see in the movies or whatever. Anyway, all right, so that's what I wanted to say to wrap up last week. All right, this week's lecture is going to be sort of fun. So you read in one of your chapters, I think it was maybe the second chapter you had for last week, you read about the World Council of Churches. All right, we're going to just briefly talk about that. The World Council of Churches. So we talked about this a little bit whenever we talked about the colonies forming and people coming from England and eventually other places too, but basically England coming over, or Europe, I should say Europe, coming over from Europe, establishing the colonies. And one of the mainstays of our Constitution was you'll have the freedom to practice the religion you choose to practice without persecution, right? Because of that freedom, we saw, or one of the consequences of that freedom, where it was all of the denominations that sort of came out of the colonies. Well, it wasn't just the colonies that were having all of these denominations happening. There were denominations that were forming splits within the same denomination, that kind of stuff. Kind of like when we talked about the Methodists going, there's a split for Calvinists and a split for Arminians, that kind of stuff. That was happening everywhere. Well, Christianity at large was sort of telescopically viewing what was happening to Christianity as a whole and seeing all of this sort of branching off. And like the illustration I gave last week or 2 weeks ago, if you have one solid unit, it is stronger and harder to break than if you split that unit into a bunch of fractions, and then they're lighter and less impactful and just are weaker. Well, the church in general, these authorities within the Christian faith were kind of telescopically looking around the world and saying, what is going on with all of these denominations forming and all these splits and all these new things that are coming up? We need to figure out a way to unify Christianity again, because right now it's on a path to continue to split apart until there's nothing left of it, right? So that's where the World Council of Churches, that's the root of where the World Council of Churches came from. The problem, and this is a problem that I bet everybody has faced at work or at home even, when you have a large group of people who are trying to live or trying to be kind of in a democracy and making decisions about how things are going to be done. The reason for the divisions, the reasons for the denominations to begin with is because something somewhere was doctrinally different enough that there was a split. So whenever you bring all of those people back together into the same room and say, okay, we need to unite, you're still going to have those little differences. It's just like having a family meeting or an office meeting or whatever, where you're trying to make a big decision and different people are just really dedicated to certain ideas. And it's very difficult, if those ideas really clash, to come to a conclusion that everybody is going to agree with, right? So because of that, when the World Council of Churches began to meet and they began to discuss how are we going to unify ourselves and strengthen Christianity as a whole, you had all of these differences that are still sort of causing problems. And the World Council of Churches ended up being more like a social movement, like a movement for social reform. More than it was a unifier of the Christian faith. Now, it doesn't mean that there wasn't unification, because much like the missionary talk that the missionary work where several churches get together and they work toward one goal, but they stay their separate churches, that was basically what was happening. So it was very difficult to come up with any sort of change that was significant enough to actually really unify Christianity the way that they were hoping that it would do. So, for example, if you were dealing with an issue where you have Well, it's just like you can pick anything in politics. Pick any issue you want. If you're going to have people that are 100% yes and 100% no, and then there's all this gray area that goes in between. And it's the two extremes that end up continuing the split, because the two extremes are those are just the people that can't meet in the middle. The people that are sort of in the gray area, they're like, well, I guess I could go this way, or I guess I could go that way. But the extremes were just kind of keeping things off the rail a little bit. So there were many, many Christian denominations that joined the World Council of Churches. Many. In fact, basically all of them joined. There were 3 groups that did not join. This is the World Council of Churches. Three groups that did not join at the time that it was officially declared a council. This was an ecumenical movement. It wasn't a council, it wasn't a council that met one time or over a series of a few years and then disbanded after the questions were answered. This was a council that was this was a movement that was going to continue. Hopefully, the idea was for it to continue forever, right? So this was an ecumenical movement as opposed to a council. But anyway, one of the groups was the Roman Catholic Church. The second group was Eastern Orthodoxy. The third group were evangelicals. And it's interesting that 2 of the 3 groups, this one and this one, those are the 2 most established, and they're the 2 longest running, most established, most deeply seated in tradition of the branches of Christianity. So it's not surprising that they would be looking at what the group is doing and the compromising that is going on, and the way that people are just bending and folding to each other, and they're like, negative. We are not compromising our doctrine in order to join this group. I think the Eastern Orthodoxy group, I think they ended up joining the WCC several years later. I think I read that somewhere, but I may be wrong. Anyway, so worldwide, the World Council of Churches is a strong group. It's a really strong group. It's interesting, though, in the United States, most people have never heard of it. And the reason most people have never heard of it is because the United States is mostly Roman Catholic and evangelical. So, especially Roman Catholic. There's a huge Roman Catholic community within the United States, and if they were not part of the council, then we don't talk about it, right? So most people in the United States don't even know that this council exists. You do, if you were to live in Europe and you were involved in a theistic movement of some sort, you would know who they are. All right, so last thing I want to talk about, that was just kind of introducing this idea of reunification of the Christian faith. All right, do you guys have this? Okay, so this last little thing, I think that this is fun. I really like talking about this. All right, the last thing I want to talk about tonight is Vatican II. All right, so this is a Catholic ecumenical council, okay? So they've had, up to this point, they've had 2 major ecumenical councils. They've had the Council of Trent, which was, in a nutshell, answering the Protestant Reformation, right? Answering to and establishing what the Roman Catholic Church is and what it is not. And then you had Vatican I, which was largely a response to to Italy being not invaded, taken over. The government was taken over, and there was a response, and how the church was it really wasn't losing power among the people, it was losing power with the government. Because the people were totally all about it, but it was losing its position a little bit. So there was a response to that in establishing, again, who we are as Roman Catholics, right? This third council, okay, so in general, depending on who you talk to, but for the purposes of this lecture tonight, in general, the Council of Trent was a response to the Protestant Reformation. Vatican I was a response to the Catholic Church sort of losing some of its influence over its territories, right, with the government. Vatican II is a very interesting council because it is the only council that was not in response to anything. This was not in response to a government or a movement or a threat of any kind. So, if you'll remember, beginning especially with the Protestant Reformation, there were people leaving the Roman Catholic Church, right? With the establishment, well, it was actually still the Catholic Church at that point. Then with the establishment of the Anglican Church, more people were leaving. And it became the Roman Catholic Church at that point. And so there were people coming in too, but there were vast numbers of people in pockets around the world that were actually leaving and joining other churches. And so there was a little bit of a fall in numbers. So this man, so first of all, Vatican II took place between 1869 and 1870. That was Vatican I. Wow, that's not 1800. I was like, that is so wrong. That's Vatican I. Woo, 1962. Now we're on board. Man, I wrote it and I was like, what just happened? Thank you. To 1965. And I was also thinking it was more than a year. Anyway, so 1962 to 1965. And it wasn't a constant council. They would meet for a few months and then break and then meet. I think they met in the fall. Anyway, you can look all that up. I mean, all of the details are online. All right, so the person who called this council, I do want you to know this Pope. Pope John the 23rd. So Pope John the 23rd was an exceptionally unique pope. One of the things that made him exceptional or unique is he was very people-oriented. He was very relational, and he had a huge heart for people. And he did not, it's like up to this point, people would, travel from other countries or, whatever, and they would want to have either an audience with the Pope, which has hardly ever happened, or what would happen more often than not is they would be allowed to stand on a balcony or stand someplace in the building as the Pope walked through the garden. And so they would be able just to see him from a distance. And many times even that was denied. But what was different about John is he said, well, why don't we just open the doors? I mean, why are we keeping people out? I mean, what are we doing that they can't see? Absolutely nothing. I mean, we should let them in and we should allow them to be, not free reign of the Vatican, let's not get crazy, but we should allow people in, we should allow people to talk to us, we should allow people to see what we do in a controlled environment, And we should just be open to the people. That's what we're here for, is for the people. So, and not only did he say, or that was his heart, but even non-Catholics. Let non-Catholics into the Vatican. Let atheists in. Let Muslims in. Let Christians, they are Christians. Let Jewish people in. Let anybody in that wants to come in. And that was a radical idea at this time. Because remember, the Catholic Church had been, from its own perspective, had been under attack for many, many years in one way or another, losing people, losing the papal lands, losing all this stuff, and then allowing themselves to be open and letting people come in. It just feels like a vulnerability that is unnecessary, but John was all about it. So for the first time in many centuries, he allowed people to come into the Vatican at certain times. All right. In existence at the same time was a group of people with the Pope at the Vatican. They were called the Curia. These were made up of, this was a group of people that were made up of, these are bishops and cardinals. And for the most part, these were older people, like in their 70s, older people, okay? And their job was to maintain the integrity of the doctrine that was being presented by the Roman Catholic Church. So they were the gatekeepers, basically. Okay? So anytime there was any sort of meeting, it doesn't have to be as big as a council, like an ecumenical council, but anytime there was a meeting where some sort of doctrine or theology or whatever was going to be discussed, potentially changed, defined, whatever, these guys were all over it. They would know about the meeting, they would research the topics for that meeting, and they would lay out what the Roman Catholic Church, what the doctrine was for that particular subject, right? So they were very important to maintaining the integrity, so to speak, of the church. They were very, very, very conservative, and they were the inner circle that surrounded the Pope. Okay? Because they were very conservative, they were not interested in a whole lot of change. So, very conservative. And really, if you start bringing in change, you're not going to be able to go very far before they say, that's too far. You're changing things too much. We need to stay where we are because we're safe here. All right. So this council, why did he call this council? Looking back on just recent history, or even longer, but looking back on especially recent history, what John the 23rd realized was, we are so closed off from the public, and we are so within ourselves. We're the only people that know our own doctrine. Like the people that we are supposed to be serving, they're not able to answer or ask questions, or they're not able to understand our answers, or they're, whatever. He was just going through and saying, what are we doing? Like, what is our purpose if we're so closed off that we're not being effective, right? So what he wanted to do, the reason he called this council was basically, for lack of a better term, he was going to update the Catholic Church, bring it into the 20th century, so to speak. Well, as we knew that they would, the Curia have, their own agenda, or not their own agenda. That made that sound mischievous. That's not true. There was an agenda for the council that was set up. They had a copy of that agenda, and they did the research that they would always do in order to bring that whenever the council started. So the very first day, everybody meets for this council. And, oh, you know what? I had some statistics. I wonder if I wrote them down. Just a minute. I wonder if I wrote it down. I hope I did. All right, I'm going to have to give you that later. So the Vatican I, I'm making up these numbers. I'm trying to make them as close as possible. So out of all of the churches that were invited into Vatican I, there were a few hundred of those people that showed up. There were like 2,500 people that showed up to the Vatican II. There was only about 250 or 260 of those who were invited that did not show up for the council. It was an amazing turnout. Oh yeah, amazing turnout. So huge room filled with, thousands of people, right? And this council gets started. Well, the first thing one of the first things that they were going to hit was, okay, we're going to have to break this up a little bit. We're going to have to form these commissions, and we're going to have to discuss these things and then come back together and have our findings presented. We can't all go through everything together, or this council's never going to end, right? So they decided that they were going to form 10 commissions. And so the Curia had already established a list of the 10 people who should lead each one of those commissions. They put it out there. Now, because this is a council, that means it's a vote. But what had always happened in the past, when the Curia put a list of men together like that, of who should be put into place, they were put into place. That's just what happened, right? Well, so they handed out their list of people, and of course, most of them are Italian. Most of them live, in Rome. They're the people that they know that are very conservative. It's going to be the people that they trust, right? Well, there was a man. His name is Achille Cardinal Leinart. I believe he is a Frenchman. He raises his hand and says, "I object to this list. How are we to vote for people that we know nothing about? How are we to put these people together and have them give them a commission when we know nothing about them? I move that we adjourn for 2 days and we get to know one another and we come up with a list of people that is a unified list." And so they said, "Okay, let's do that. All in favor, all, whatever, however they run these councils. I don't know. I made that up. I don't know how they do it. Some sort of vote. And 15 minutes after the council started that day, it was over for the day. And they spent the next couple of days getting to know one another, introducing each other, learning about one another, and compiling their list of people that they wanted to have in charge of these commissions. Well, the Curia were less than impressed. They did not like this at all because they had lost control over who was going to be there and therefore the doctrine that may come out of it, right? Or the changes that may happen. A couple of days later, new commission lists were made, and very, very few of the men who were on the original list set forth by the Curia were on that list. But what was interesting about the new list, it represented a true cross-section of Christianity globally. It was very well represented culturally and had a lot of leaders that would be able to bring something in that not just Rome, just impressions besides what everyone knew that was going on in Rome. So John was very excited. He loved it. And Curia is still not impressed at all. So they do some work, that council ends, and they meet the next year. It's supposed to meet in the fall of the next year, but in June of the next year, Pope John passes away. Okay? And oddly enough, he was so loved. He was so loved. And people thought perhaps, it was a theory, it's not true, but it was a theory that he was assassinated because of his radical but there's no proof that I've found in any literature that says that. He simply passed away. It was just time. So now everybody kind of flips out. Everybody sort of is waiting to see who the next pope is going to be, and that pope will decide whether or not the council will continue the next year or that year. So he can just stop Vatican I at that point. So the next pope that came in was John VI. Should put his title up there, Pope John VI. He came in, he was asked, "Do you want to continue the council?" And he said, "Yeah, let's continue the council. That sounds like a great idea to me." So the council did continue, and it met several more times over the, 4 years? 2, 3, 4, 5, 3 years. So what I really want to talk about, though, this is what's very interesting. Some really phenomenal things came out of Vatican II. Really phenomenal things. And as a person who did not grow up in the Roman Catholic Church and had my own biases growing up, I have more respect for the Roman Catholic Church because of Vatican II than any other thing that I've ever read about or heard about or anything. It is just an incredible show of humility and trying to make amends for some things, trying to establish some things, keeping firm on some things. It wasn't just a council where the church said, cowers and does something. And it's not a council where they say, no, this is the way it's going to be, and we're not going to change anything ever. It was it's almost in the gray, where some of it was in total humility, where the Roman Catholic Church as a unit was saying, we were wrong. We should have done this. We should not have done that. And we are going to apologize. And then there were other things where they said, absolutely not. We will not move on this specific ideal. And this is who we are as Roman Catholics. And I just have a lot of respect for a huge organization like that that's, old, staunch in tradition, to be able to step back and say, we could have done things a little bit differently, but there are some things that we absolutely will not do differently. And I just think that's a phenomenal action to take. So that's why I like talking about it so much, because I think it's awesome. So I want to talk about a few of the things that that came out of the council. Actually, before I say that, I have a few points. This is just for your information. I'm not going to test you over this, but the council, like I said, it was brought up so that they could modernize the church and kind of bring it into the 20th century, so to speak, because the Roman Catholic Church felt that the viewpoint from the outside in, even by its own members, but from the outside in, was that the church is old and it's outdated and has no concept of how we're living today. And so they wanted to change that idea about themselves. They also wanted to reform the church from the inside without losing the integrity of the doctrine. The final thing that they wanted to do, by doing those two things, what they wanted to do was become more engaged with the world outside of the Vatican. They wanted to get to know other Christians. They wanted to get to know other denominations. They wanted to get to know non-Christians. It was a very loving and sort of open attitude. That's why they met and what they wanted to accomplish from it. Now, so a few of the things that changed, this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just a few things that I thought were cool. You can go online and see. In fact, I have some of them printed out here. You can go online and read all of the different things that came out of it, but just some really interesting things. One of the things that came out of Vatican II, no more tridentine Mass. And what that means is the tridentine Mass means it was the priests faced away from the audience. Mm-hmm. And they also spoke Latin. So it didn't mean the Mass was gone. That absolutely did not go away. But what did happen is the priests faced the people. Yeah, faced the people and, get ready, spoke in the language of the people. Yep. So now, that was a move. I mean, if you want to engage somebody, speak to them in their own language. Right? Yep. It's an amazing thing. I mean, it seems like, looking back on it, it's like, duh. But seriously, this was a radical change. This is thousands of years of tradition that are being changed. It's a big deal. Something else that came out of it. Oh man, this was amazing. So, there was an official acknowledgement of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Of the EAT? That is a Freudian slip, I'm sure. Orthodoxy. I don't think I spelled that right, but you guys know how to spell it. All right. So, an official acknowledgement of Eastern Orthodoxy. So you guys remember that in 1054, right? Everybody remembers 1054. That papal bull walked right into the Hagia Sophia placed on the pulpit, and there was an official excommunication of Eastern Orthodoxy from the Catholic Church. That existed until Vatican II. It's an amazing thing. They were called, this Eastern Orthodoxy Church, up until this point, were known as the separated, well, actually, it was probably more after this council that they were called this, the separated brethren. But it's just that after the council, they were no longer separated. So one of the things they did, so one of the people who was at the Vatican II council was the ecumenical patriarch at the time, whose name I don't have, but the ecumenical patriarch of the entire Eastern Orthodoxy Church was at Vatican II. The Roman Catholic Church approached him, and this is a public thing. They approached him. They officially acknowledged that the separation was probably something that shouldn't have happened. They apologized. They asked for forgiveness. And they asked if the Orthodoxy Church would become brethren with them again. And the patriarch was like, totally, I'm completely on board. That sounds great. So Vatican II healed the papal bull separation that created that huge branch. It healed it. Now, it doesn't mean that Orthodoxy is now Catholicism or Catholicism is now Orthodoxy. They still maintain their splits. But the difference is that there can be open communication now. Unfortunately, because the split is so far apart, I mean, they've been separated for so long, it's still very difficult for communication to happen that is, mind-blowing. But still, this was an act of humility that is amazing, really amazing. And the Roman Catholic Church, in my personal opinion, is to be commended for being so humble. Another thing that happened, again, humility. There was, and we've talked about this quite a bit, there was, not necessarily throughout the entire Roman Catholic Church as a whole, but as you all know, the Protestants who came out of the Reformation, they were all Catholic people. Different monasteries, Augustinian and Benedictine and blah, blah, right, Franciscan. But they were still all, at their heart, at their root, they're Catholic. And we talked about how Martin Luther became very anti-Semitic at the end of his life. He's not the only one. I pick on him a lot because I just know it happens to be the truth for him. But there was anti-Semitism that was sort of bred, and that seeped. Interestingly enough, it kind of seeped into the Catholic Church on a very small scale. And one of the things that it's not that the Roman Catholic Church was anti-Semitic, because that is not true. However, there was a stance that was taken by the church for many years that condemned the Jewish people because they were responsible for the death of the Messiah. Okay, so it wasn't anti-Semitism, but it was definitely you guys messed up and killed the Messiah sort of stance. What came out of this council was, and this is a quote from the council, "The Jews at the time of Christ and all Jews today are no more responsible for the death of Christ than Christians." And it's interesting because I can promise you that on that day when the people were screaming, "Crucify him," they were not all Jewish people. Not by any stretch. And so, it's just interesting. And so they apologized to basically the Jewish community and said, we should not have made any connection between your people and it being your fault that the Messiah is dead. That's not the way, we should not have propagated that idea. And it's interesting, this was a 1900-year-old doctrine. 1900 years they had been, I don't really know how to use the words right because it's not an anti-Semitic movement, but it's just basically a blame game, right? So after 1900 years of accusations, maybe that's the best way to say it, the church acknowledged and apologized to the Jewish people or nation for their part that they played in contributing to any sort of anti-Semitism regarding the crucifixion of Christ. Again, another quote that came out of this council said, "True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction who were then alive, nor against the Jews of today. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. We all see, all should see to it then that in catechetical work or in the preaching of the Word of God, they do not teach anything that does not conform to the truth of the gospel in the Spirit of Christ. Furthermore, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecution, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time by anyone." So it was an incredible, just an incredible motion, and again, an act of humility that is just to be commended. All right, 2 more, and then we're done. Another one was the index. Remember, we talked about the index, the list of books or writings or teachings or whatever that were forbidden. The index was abolished. In other countries, not so much in the United States, but even in other countries at the time of this council, the early 60s, people were still being physically persecuted for being caught with any of those on the list. The people here, we weren't being persecuted for it, but people were scared. Like if you were in the Roman Catholic Church prior to Vatican II, you probably still wouldn't have these things in your house because it was just absolutely forbidden. And and like I said, one of those things was the Bible because there were Protestant versions of it, and the official Roman Catholic Bible was in Latin. So if you didn't know Latin, you know, and the Roman Catholic Church felt, and a lot of churches feel this way, but felt that it was their responsibility to relay the information, not your responsibility to get the information for yourself. So that's a harsh statement, but I mean, it's give or take. It's not quite so much that way now. Oh, yeah.
They want you to have all, so
That like includes the Apocrypha.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Everything.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I'm saying they're saying this, but yet they still do things that way.
Yeah. Well, and that may be a compromise. That may be just their way of saying, well, yes, you can read the doctrine, but we want to protect you. So we want you to only have this that we know is safe for you to read. I mean, that's a very fair viewpoint coming from the viewpoint of the church. Coming from the viewpoint outside the church, it may sound like you're, just let them read the Bible. But, coming from the viewpoint of I'm responsible for you, that just may be where they're coming from. I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying, I don't know if that's it. But anyway, it was an amazing thing. And then finally, the last thing that happened, well, not the last thing, but the last thing I'm going to talk about, is actually what you were talking about. It was actually, not only was this abolished, but reading the Bible was encouraged. It may be the Bible they want you to read, but still, it's a huge step. I mean, we're talking about, how hard is it for you guys? Just put yourself in a position. How hard is it as a person who may be in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, whatever. If you have done something one way for the past 15 years, the past 25 years, the past 35 years, and then one day they come up and say, you can't buy a paper ticket anymore. You have to purchase your airline tickets through the app. You don't really have to. But you know what I'm saying? Like, what happens whenever somebody tells you that? You're like, what? I want to write a check and I want you to give me the little, the 4 papers that you have to tear off the first one and give it to that person and that one, and this is my copy. I mean, that's just how you feel about life because that's what you know and that's what you grew up with.
It's kind of like when they switched, like everyone getting debit cards for like your,
Yeah.
the government switched it,
Yeah.
and whether you liked it or not, you had to get a debit card.
That's right.
No checks, no.
That's right. I mean, it's a radical feel. Now, now that's just something where there's very little consequence other than maybe somebody hacking into your bank account. There's very little consequence for you using, do you know what I'm saying? Like in general, there's no consequence. We're talking about the governing authority of millions of people, and they have decided to come through here and say, all right, we're going to abolish this. And one of the things that was on here, even though you're right, one of the things that's on here, we're going to encourage you to read it. We want you to be in the Word of God. I mean, what? That's amazing. It's an amazing display of faith. I mean, I am just impressed like nobody's business with the Catholic Church and Vatican II. And there's lots of other stuff that come out of it. One of the things that they absolutely established was the authority of the scriptures and tradition. That's absolutely, that is a doctrine that they've held from the very beginning and established for sure in Trent and reestablished and, reaffirmed in Vatican II. So not everything changed. Some things were very much kept, but it's just these apologies and these are radical moves. I mean, they're just radical. And it's a lot of them. I mean, how many of us would be able to handle, you have to do that electronically, and you now have to have a smartphone, and you have to, you know what I mean? Like all the stuff that comes through that, like the younger generation is like, well, why would we do it any other way? And we're like, and so, I mean, that's basically what's happened here. I mean, they went from, pick a century. They went from the 4th century or the 16th century or the whatever. They radically moved forward into the 20th century, and they did it all in a matter of a few years.
And to speak the language of the people and to face the people rather than...
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Those are phenomenal steps, and in my opinion, strengthen the church.
I do have to tell you, because I do work for the tribes,
Mm-hmm.
that the priests still, today, do not face the public.
Is that right? Oh, so they're allowed to, but they're not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Well, that's their tradition in the Native
In the
community.
Oh, I see.
That's their tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So he's facing away from the people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first went, I was all like,
What are you doing?
why is he not looking at us?
Are we on the wrong side? Are we supposed to sit over there?
So now that you're saying it, now I totally understand it.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a lot of these things, you go through, if there's any way that you can put yourself in the shoes of the people who are doing it, sometimes you come up with these ideas or these, not to say it's justified, like you could put yourself in Lenin's shoes and you could be like, oh yeah, I can see why you did that. Doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean you agree with it. Doesn't mean you're all over, mass killing of people, but you can kind of see where he started and where he was going. And man, you do that with this council and all of the thousands of years, amazing, just amazing. So anyway, that's it. That's it, you guys. Homework is I think it's your last unit. It's 3 chapters, 46, 47, and 48. We will have our last lecture and our last quiz next week. And I mean, as long as I'm able to be here next Monday. If I'm not here next Monday, then the schedule gets pushed out to the next week. But
So then we won't have class if you're not here.
right, I will, except for Ernest. I don't know how to get a hold of him, but if something happens, then I can either have Con come down here or I can send you guys a message or whatever. But I haven't had that issue so far, but I don't know. It makes me nervous to go on call. So anyway, so that's it, you guys. And we'll have a test in 2 weeks.